You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Welcome to the first episode of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium Diplomaci podcast. Diplomaci is a student-driven project aimed at promoting foreign policy thinking through Hungarian eyes. We analyze different regions of the world to present best practices, stories, and cooperation that might be of interest from a Hungarian perspective. And our first guest today is Rodrigo Bellester, Head of Center for European Studies. Welcome, Rodrigo, and thank you for being here.
Köszönöm szépen. Köszönöm a meghívást.
There are few places on the earth that are more distant from us than Latin America, and you know a lot about Latin America. So I would really like to ask you to say a few things about how we should imagine the region. How is Latin America? How are the politics there?
Hungary is not naturally attracted by South America. You have virtually no links, cultural links with this continent. And it's true that it's extremely exotic from a Hungarian perspective. Still, there are some aspects that should be extremely interesting for you as well, and on which I would also encourage my Hungarian fellows to pay more attention. From a political point of view, and if you consider today that the Western world, including South America, is the theater of a cultural war, where woke ideas are gaining a lot of traction, and then also the resistance to these woke ideas is also now starting to be constituted. I would say that within this theater, this battlefield, South America is by far the place where those woke ideas are winning, are getting, close to an hegemony. And so that's worrying. That's very bad news for the rest of the Western world. And so this is already something that you should be aware of. Second, a lot of those ideas are very, very much inspired in extreme left-wing ideologies, if not Marxisms. Hungarians know a lot about it because they had, communist dictatorships for 45 years. And so, again, they should also be worried in the evolutions there. And also, since they know already what they're talking about, they can also be of help in order to organize, if you want, some movements, or at least advise some movements that are going to neutralize, or at least to start fighting those cultural wars as well. And then the third thing that is also very, very worrying is that you have an increasing link between some of those political movements, extreme left-wing, so neo-communist movements, and the narcos, basically the drug trafficking. In countries like Venezuela, the links are obvious. In Mexico as well. Also, for example, recently you had very, very telling pictures or little videos of the president of Mexico who went to pay tribute, or with his best smile to the mother of El Chapo Guzman, who is basically the biggest drug trafficker today in the world. And so I think it's also very important to take that into account. Large parts of South America, of Latin America, are today ruled more by narco drug dealers than by politicians. And there's a growing tendency of the extreme left to find alliances with them, with this de facto power. Another very, very appalling example is the new president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who is himself a former terrorist. He recently went to the UN's General Assembly in last September, to ask for the legalization of cocaine. So not of the coca leaves, but of cocaine, so the drug. He wants to legalize it, and he was arguing that climate change is actually more dangerous and is worse for the health than cocaine. So this is the level of demagogy that you can find. And so those three aspects are very, very relevant, maybe more for other countries in the EU like Spain, but I think definitely that Hungary should be aware of them too.
And what do you think about the region's relation with the United States?
This is an extremely complex and contradictory relationship. For centuries, since the the minute of the United States were born, the relationships with their neighbors from the south, wherever they were, at some point it was the Spanish Empire, then it was mostly Mexico. Those relations are extremely complex. So those are relations of rivalry, and also of humiliation. A large part of today's United States of America was basically gained on Mexico. California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, those were Mexican territories that Mexico has been losing gradually. And also, you also have a very unbalanced relationship. We're speaking in the north about one of the most, if not the most developed country in the world, and in the south, countries that are poorer. So you have also this relationship of migration, not so much with Mexico. Mexicans tend to migrate less, but they did in the past, but also with Central America. So you have this very asymmetrical relationship between a very rich and powerful neighbor in the north and several neighbors in the south that are poorer and geopolitically, of course, much, much weaker. And so the history of their relationship is one of dominance, sometimes alliances, a lot of humiliation as well, rivalries, sometimes disdain. The way, for example, South Americans call the US like los gringos. That can also be very pejorative, and also a story of during the Cold War of direct interventions of the US in South American territory. And also of direct intervention of the Soviet Union in South America. Remember, for example, the crisis of the missiles in Cuba in 1963 or 4, I think, and also how the US was more backing the resistance to the communist dictatorship in Cuba, while this one, the later, was also getting also the support of the Soviet Union. So don't forget that South America was also one of the battlefields of the Cold War. And it was not only Vietnam, it was not only Afghanistan, it was very much also South America. You could also, Nicaragua was also a very good example of that. Chile to a certain extent as well. And now today, the leading power, in the South America against the US is probably Venezuela. But again, today the problem is that the vast majority of the countries, they're actually all of them except Ecuador and Guatemala, are very much, on the extreme left. The last one was Lula, the elections in Brazil. And so we can also see a very polarized continent, but again, where today the majority, at least of the governments for sure, lies on the left/extreme left.
You mentioned Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the current Brazilian president, and I'm really interested, what do you think about the Brazilian elections and if it changed South America's relation with other countries or internationally in any ways?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. This was a crucial election because if Bolsonaro would have won them and would have stayed in power, you would have a much more balanced, politically balanced continent. But he lost them. So first, there are doubts about the validity of the results. I mean, Brazil is a continent basically, and some people claim that the way the votes was carried out, in electronic votes, and sometimes, in some regions, the guarantees of a fair elections were not on the table. So, first thing. Second, it also gives you the image of a very polarized country, where, half of the country basically doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the other half. So we don't have a common ground today, and I think this can be applied to a lot of countries in the Western world. And also, it shows you what is also the importance of the judiciary power that sometimes also takes part in some of the political battles. I mean, Lula was accused of corruption. He was in jail for that, but because of procedural matters was freed. And today, for example, in Brazil, one of the important features is also the prominent role of the president of the Supreme Court, Mr. Moro, I think is called, Sergio Moro, who basically is a power within the power. So you see a lot of symptoms of unrest that you can find in Brazil. You can find them in the rest of the continent, also in the rest actually of the Western world. And of course, from a geopolitical point of view, when the biggest country in South America also goes left, it has consequences for the whole continent, and to a certain extent as well to to the Western world. So those elections were crucial, and indeed, let's hope that Brazil will remain a peaceful country. I don't think there is a risk of a civil war. We shouldn't exaggerate, but you have a very, very polarized country, and I don't know. I think now we have to see the future of the opposition, who is going to take now the succession of Jair Bolsonaro, maybe his wife, for example. That's an option, but I'm not very sure about it. And but again, yes, it was those were crucial elections, and from a very personal point of view, the Brazilians didn't take the right choice.
What do you think about the elections' effects on the Hungarian-Brazilian bilateral relations?
There, I don't think it will have a huge effect because, Hungary and Brazil are not like privileged partners. If you ask me about Portugal and Brazil, that's another story. If you ask me about Brazil and India, that's a different story. Hungary and Brazil have few relationships. Most of them are trade relationships. So Hungary will certainly not be Lula's best friend. But I don't think this is going to change to be a game changer in the bilateral relations. The presence of Hungary in South America is limited, and it's normal. And that can be also explained for a lot of factors. The size of Hungary, the lack of cultural ties, and things like that. So that's why when you don't have like a very high-profile political role, normally you don't get the bad consequences of political elections neither. So there, I don't think there is a huge case.
And since we are talking about Brazil, Argentina and Brazil have started negotiations about a common currency, probably called SUR. We know that they have the goal to gain a bigger independence from the United States of America and from the American dollar. How do you see the SUR's future?
I'm extremely skeptical about it, The regional cooperation within Latin America has not been a huge success, ever. They didn't implement it well. There are some other organizations already, like the ALBA, the Alianza Bolivariana, which was basically a joke. You also had Mercosur, a more serious machine, but that didn't cover the whole continent. And today, again, it's not doing extremely well. What I find very paradoxical here is that countries that basically speak the same language, two languages, but Portuguese and Spanish is so close that you don't even need translators in the room, are totally unable to act together. Compare it to the European Union, you have 24 official languages, and we did much, much, much more than anything they ever dreamed to do. You also have some important rivalries, some territorial conflicts among some of the countries. And so I think this initiative about a common currency is basically, it was dead the minute they started speaking about it. I don't think they have the capacity to create it. I think it will be just some political noise. I wouldn't bet anything on that. For me, it's less liable than Bitcoin.
Some experts said that maybe the SUR is the first step towards a Latin American Union. So you are more skeptical about this?
Extremely skeptical. Again, it has been decades and decades that they try to do something like that, and it doesn't work, and it never worked. The most integrated machine they managed to create was Mercosur. Not bad. It was it had some influence, some cohesion, but otherwise they used to have competing alliances as well. And it very much depends on the politics. And if now any initiative that is launched by extreme left or leftist governments will be inexorably contested and probably cancelled once the governments change, if they ever change. So again, extremely skeptical about SUR, extremely skeptical about any type of national integration there, and to basically create a federal Latin America. Again, I don't know, maybe my grandchildren will see it, but neither you nor me.
Thank you very much. I am confident enough to say that Spain and Portugal are the two European countries with the most Latin American relations. And this is not surprising, thinking of the fact that they speak the same languages. And I'm really interested that you're from Spain. How do you see the actual Spanish Latin American political, economical, and cultural relations?
So what you said, first of all, is absolutely true. The main two countries that are interested in South America in the European Union are Spain and Portugal. The others are far, far less interested. So this is a bit like the monopoly of those two countries, and I would say even more Spain than Portugal. From a political point of view, between Spain and South America, I'm extremely worried and I'm extremely sad. Both Spain and the majority of South America have extreme left-wing and extreme left-wing governments. And for example, for me, it's a shame and it's a source of concern to see some of the ministers, of the Spanish ministers, for example, going to Venezuela so often, getting money from Venezuela for their political movements, getting sometimes even narco dollars for that. And so there again, from a political point of view, I think now the current Spanish government is not in an institutional dimension, where basically it's normal that Spain is also very proactive there. It's a very good thing, and whatever the government is, they should do that. This is diplomacy. This is actually geopolitics. Every Spanish government should be very active in South America, but not the way my current government is active now, which is more from an ideological point of view and not from an institutional one. From an economic point of view, Spain still remains extremely active there. The biggest banks, a lot of multinationals are Spanish there. Think about Telefónica, for example, which is like the Spanish telecom company, is extremely, extremely present in South America. Think also about Repsol, which is the Spanish oil company, again, has a huge and massive presence in South America. Banco Santander, the largest bank in Europe, but also in South America. So there, from an economic point of view, Spain remains, I guess the second biggest investor there, maybe after the US. But given the size of Spain, this is actually huge. So again, we are this is a strategic territory for Spain, and then really the relationship should remain as strong and as depoliticized as possible. And you also mentioned culture. Culture means that first the language. It's basically the third language in the world, and it's growing, and it's very much growing. And also, it's also a history of brotherhood. Despite all this left-wing propaganda on colonization and white people being guilty of all the problems in the world, don't forget that the Spanish colonization and what we call la Hispanidad has been a very, very important community for centuries, and even in the last decades, until this woke craze, invaded everything. And when I was 30 years old or 20 years old, so basically 20 or 30 years ago, the day of the Hispanidad, El Día de la Hispanidad, was very much celebrated. And again, the relationships between Spain and its former colonies is much more appeased than any other country. It's not France and Algeria. It's not the UK and India, for example. There is much more brotherhood there because of the language, and also because, don't forget that the Spanish colonization of this continent was basically based on mixing, on the mix of races and the mix of populations. Starting from the very beginning, Hernán Cortés married an Aztec princess, Malinche. So from the very, very beginning, there was a mix. And so South America today is basically the result of this mix. And so that also created, if you want, some brotherhood relationships that today, despite like the woke propaganda, still resist. And also bear in mind that most of the independence process of in the 19th century, independence from Spain, were actually run by a white elite there, not by the indigenous population, who were actually much more attached to the Spanish Empire. Not least because since the 16th century, we had laws already recognizing the citizenship of every Indian, for example, in the Spanish Empire. So since basically the Catholic kings, 15th century, an Aztec or a Maya or a Quechua or whatever were as citizens of the Empire of Spain as Spanish people from Sevilla, for example. Those things create a lot of brotherhood that will go beyond the noise of ideologies.
This is really, really interesting. And I'm also really interested in your opinion about the region's future. Do you think it will change in any way in the future? Will they fulfill any different roles in the international politics or in the international economy?
I'm worried about the near future because of the majority of the governments they have now. Again, governments that are based on extreme ideologies and are some of them close links with the narco. Who can be optimistic about it? Look at Mexico. I would say the north of Mexico is de facto not controlled by the state. It's controlled by the narcos, and it means that they have a territorial, they're occupying territories basically, and where they decide what is wrong or bad, where they apply their own laws. Is that a good news or? No, it's not. Absolutely not. So in a country like Mexico, the narco has never been so powerful, for example. Then you also have problems of instability in Central America. Central America is like the small countries. Nicaragua today is one of the worst dictatorships in the world. They jail bishops, for example. There's no freedom of religion there, and the country is run by a dictator who has been there for I don't know how many decades, and his wife, who has a reputation of being a witch. She does esoteric, rites and things like that. So how can I be optimistic about it? Look also at Argentina. Argentina is now a country where the former president has been not charged, but basically sentenced for corruption. And she still has the backup of these very clientelist, voters. Basically what we call like the peronización. So basically like the process of launched by already the dictator and the leader, the Argentinian leader, Juan Domingo Perón, which is an ideology which is very difficult to catalogate, It's difficult to put a label on it, but basically it's about buying the will of the people and turning them into very assisted population, and you just give them charity and then they shut up. That's basically what Peronismo is. And you still have it today. So again, a very big player like Argentina is not doing well at all. It has huge problems of inflation. When I hear that we have 20% of inflation in the European Union, in Argentina it's probably, I don't know how many, 100%. In Venezuela, it's thousands of percent. And again, I'm neither optimistic about even the Ecuador, for example, which is a country that used to be more peaceful. It used to be like a safe haven, not safe haven, but basically a more stable country in South America that never had problems of narco, for example. Now they do. And their former president from Correa, who is now based in Belgium, is pulling a lot of strings in order to destabilize the south of the country, for example, and also to make sure that the narcos have more power there. In some cities of Ecuador in the south, like Guayaquil, which is the largest city, not the capital, but the largest city, now you have officially problems of narco. You have some narcos that go to they can go to a restaurant and shoot people just to intimidate them. That never happened in Ecuador. So the near future, I'm extremely pessimistic. I think the only solution will come from, again, the next round of elections, hoping as well that the left is not going to play the cards of the street. In several countries, for example, that was very obvious in Chile, the extreme left first organized the riots on the streets, and then, of course, when people go to vote, they are very intimidated. And everything was done that, for example, in Chile, that if the candidate cast, so the conservative candidate would have won, you would have had probably a huge civil conflict there. So I'm not saying that Boric, the current president, didn't win fairly. He did win fairly. He had the majority of the votes. I'm just saying those elections were somehow conditioned by 2 or 3 years of violence that resulted, for example, in the metro of Santiago being totally vandalized. Those are very serious things. Some churches were burned in Santiago de Chile. So, of course, and then also a lot of people said, look, thank God Boric won, so the left-wing candidate, because if the other one would have won, the extreme left, wouldn't have allowed it. So even in Chile, which was by far the most democratic state and the most stable state historically in South America, the situation is not going any better. So I cannot give you any good news about Latin America. I just hope that, maybe the next cycle of elections or maybe some very long-run movements, will bring less corruption and more competent and less ideological leaders in this continent. imagine, that I even think that the only country that for me still gives me a bit of hope, paradoxically, is Brazil. Brazil has maybe a set of institutions or a population that basically is maybe more democratically mature. So even if I disagree with Lula, it's really not the person I would have voted for, but still, I think in Brazil, and despite also the high polarization, this country is maybe a little more mature than the others. But that's the only good news I can tell you about South America. So one more reason to care about it, because if this continent collapses, believe me, you will also hear about it here in Hungary.
Thank you very much. These were all my questions for today. I really appreciate you being here.
Many thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.